Welcome to the Conversation Lab. My name is Don Schaefer, and this is Sticks and Stones, Roots and Bones. It's the name of this radio program and podcast series, and is part of my dissertation project as we explore the science, psychology, cultural, and emotional components of our conversations. With the help of experts around the world, we're looking at the cause and effect of polarization and the impact it has on our conversations. Joining us today to help with this research project is Tzeporah Berman. Tzeporah is a Canadian environmental activist, campaigner, and writer. She's been designing environmental campaigns and working on environmental policy in Canada and beyond for over 30 years. She's currently the International Program Director at Stand.earth and chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. She's the former co-director of Greenpeace International's Global Climate and Energy Program and the co-founder of Forest Ethics, which is now Stand.earth. You may remember Tzeporah for her role as one of the organizers of the logging blockades in Clayoquot Sound. Tzeporah is the author of This Crazy Time, Living Our Environmental Challenge, and has published opinion pieces in the Globe and Mail, the National Observer, the Guardian, the Financial Times, and she travels around the world, changing hearts and minds, one or more conversations at a time. I don't know how you do it.
I don't know. A lot of people ask me that lately, because I think because it's you don't often find activists who are in their 50s, like people are like, you're still at it. And I love it. I mean, I can't imagine doing anything else. I feel so privileged that I get to do this work, that it's not just, I mean, like my mantra is like, I get to work on during the day what keeps me up at night, and I get to do something about it. And so I don't know, I feel full of energy. But I am really careful. Like I do meditation. I have a meditation practice and a yoga practice, and I get out into nature at least 3 or 4 times a week to be on the beach or in the forest. I rejuvenate. You have to.
Have you always done that?
I think it's gotten better as I've gotten older. And also you need it more.
Yeah.
Your body's no longer rubber. It just bounces back no matter what, in your 50s, as you may know, it doesn't. But also I think I have more time now than I did when I had kids at home, and trying to be an activist and have kids at home. Those were long days.
So before we jump into all my questions about how polarization impacts our conversations, can you talk a little bit about your work at Stand.earth and how it's going with the Fossil Fuel Proliferation Treaty?
So I'm now working with 2 different big organizations. Stand.earth, who I helped found, is running an incredible campaign here in British Columbia to stop the expansion of fracking and LNG, as well as in a campaign on old growth forests and protecting old growth. What can I tell you about those campaigns? I mean, people can find more information online, but actually one of the most exciting things I think is really cool is we're using new technology and investigative research to create what we're calling Forest Eye. So we now have a program online that uses Google Earth and satellite data that can send out alerts and immediately let people know if industry or government are logging or road building in an old growth forest. And that program is awesome because it's actually providing real-time data and exposing the government to its own lack of knowledge and lies. I think both are happening. But for the past couple of years, the government has been saying, oh, we're protecting old growth. Yeah, we committed to it. We're protecting it. And we're like, no, old growth trees are still falling. They're like, no. So we just decided to put all the information online so people can see for themselves. And I love that program, Forest Eye. And another big program that we're working on is cleaning up the fashion industry. Fashion industry is like 6% of global emissions. It is so dirty. There are new coal plants being built around the world just for fast fashion. So we do research on 50 companies every year. We produce a report card now, a decarbonization report card for the fashion industry. If you're wondering what you're wearing, H&M, Gap, where they sit, you can go online to Stand.earth's report card and you can see the different climate policies of the different companies. And in doing that, we're embarrassing them, and the companies are putting in place new policies, which is awesome. And surprised to find out that one of the worst climate policies in the world is a Vancouver-based company, Lululemon, who literally are making their leggings out of fracked gas and using coal energy from Asia. So we're running a campaign right now to convince Lululemon to be an industry leader on climate. And those are just some of the campaigns at Stand. And then I'm also the founder and chair of the fossilfueltreaty.org, which is a global campaign. 8 national governments have already endorsed the fossil fuel treaty and have proposed it on the floor of the UN. And it's growing very quickly. Millions of people are signing up, and we now have over 2,000 organizations, health organizations, faith organizations, cities, environmental groups, big and small, all over the world, who have joined the campaign that's growing really fast.
So what's your greatest hope?
A livable planet. I mean, with the fossil fuel treaty, we're trying to ensure that countries cooperate on who's producing what and how much and where of the 3 products that are killing us: oil, gas, and coal. Climate change is complicated, but there are 3 things that are the result of the 86% of the emissions trapped in our atmosphere and smothering the earth and causing the wildfires that are burning our country down. And that's oil, gas, and coal. And we now have the technology to replace them in most uses, and yet we're stockpiling them. We're on track to produce 110% more oil, gas, and coal by 2030 than we can ever burn on the surface of the planet, or it will burn us. It'll take us past 2 degrees. And so we need to actually constrain the production of oil, gas, and coal. And for 30 years, climate policy and negotiations have only been about constraining emissions. So the fossil fuel treaty would be a complement to the Paris Agreement and would push countries to cooperate on who gets to produce what fossil fuels and where, instead of just leaving it up to the marketplace. It would be a systemic change in how and who gets to produce fossil fuels and where, that could be based on rules of equity and fairness and climate stability. And there's a good growing support for that. So that's how the world will be different if we get a fossil fuel treaty.
I sure hope you're right, but I don't know. We haven't done a very good job with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We're way behind on our reconciliation objectives, and I don't think we've done a very good job with climate change.
Well, actually, we've done quite a lot. What's really interesting about Canadian climate policy is that we do have some really good policies. We're one of the only countries in the world that is working to put in place a national price on carbon, which is really important. We have to price pollution to make it expensive to pollute. That's right. We have mandates and targets now for zero emission vehicles. We have, a scale up in energy efficiency, in get net zero buildings. So we actually have some fairly good policies in place on the demand side. The big problem for Canada is 2 big problems are transportation. We need to move quicker to electrify transportation. But the biggest problem is the oil and gas sector. We're one of the only countries in the world where emissions just from the production of oil and gas are the largest cause of emissions in Canada, the largest cause of pollution in Canada, which is amazing because 80% of the barrel is emissions that are burned outside of Canada. So just producing the stuff, we produce so much of it and it's so dirty that our emissions just from production will wipe out the progress we're making in all these other places, in all these other ways. And so until Canada gets a handle on capping expansion, stopping the expansion of the oil and gas industry, and managing a wind down of that industry, then we're not going to be able to bend the curve on our own emissions. And successive levels of government have avoided that because it is very political. However, what they're refusing to do is to acknowledge that if we don't do this, we will have to. We're going to be forced to do it in the future as demand goes down for the product. Because as electric cars have been kind of taken up around the world, and now there are new policies in place in over 90 countries to ban the fossil fuel car, including in Canada, by 2030, 2040. As those policies come into place, the demand for oil and gas drops significantly. So even the International Energy Agency is saying, no new expansion of fossil fuels, no new projects fit in a net zero scenario. and we expect demand to peak and fall very quickly. So at that point, we just end up with massive billions of dollars in stranded assets, and it's going to be kind of one of those boom and bust situations. Instead, we should be capping expansion now and managing the wind down. And our politicians should be responsible for putting in place those policies to do that. But instead, they're just continuing the rhetoric of the oil and gas industry because they're afraid. They're afraid that if they push that change, they're going to be vulnerable, especially to conservative attack before the next election. And so they're a lot more worried right now about maintaining the status quo in votes than they are about climate change.
That's such a great answer and so much more fulsome than my perspective or my comment about we just haven't done a good job. But I think that speaks to why we're having this conversation. And certainly from my perspective, I think it speaks to the work that you do. So with my research question in mind, what are the causes and effects of polarization and how does it impact the conversations we have? I wonder if you could talk about your work, past and present, and what impact this body of work has had on the conversations you have today, and how have they changed?
Don, that's a really big question. Past and present, and what I've learned, and what's changed.
Yeah,
Okay.
If you had to reflect on the journey, what's it been like?
Well, look, in a broad sweep, I think when I started this work in my 20s, I really thought there are good guys and there are bad guys, and I know what side of the fence I'm on. And it was all really black and white. And then there was a big period through my 30s and 40s where things got really gray. You know, it wasn't as clear as I thought. It turns out that there are good people everywhere. And sometimes there are good people that are stuck in bad systems. And I started really turning a lot of my attention to how do I create common purpose with people who are a part of all walks of life to create solutions that last instead of just forcing people to make different choices, so I think my campaign work and the work that I do became, more sophisticated, more complex. I think I realized that you can't just build power on the outside and scream about being right. You also have to change the systems on the inside, or at least figure out how to use that power on the inside for lasting change. But what's fascinating about reflecting on it like that, and I would say those are the early days of when I was, first blockading logging and getting involved in re-envisioning what logging could look like and trying to understand the intersection between indigenous rights and colonization and extractive industries and what do solutions look like. When I first started this work, I thought, we need to stop all logging and old growth. And then what? Ring fence it? Like, what happens to indigenous communities who live there? What is a protected area, in fact? How do you decide what gets to happen in a protected area? Who gets to decide? How do you support communities who have been economically dependent on logging and large quantities of wood fiber in an extractive model? So, peeling back those layers took time, and trying to understand then how to create conversations and less polarization while still building power and pointing out what's wrong with our existing systems. That's an art form. And I think over the years, there are times when I course corrected badly. I became too close to those that stand to benefit from the status quo, and that led to incrementalism. I think there are also times when I became too wedded to being on the outside and fighting the good fight, and I missed opportunities to actually create change and new policy. So, I certainly wouldn't say that I've figured it all out. But I will say that in the last couple of years, in some ways for me, I've gone all the way around back to the beginning, because knowing what I knew about my experience with wood and paper products and forestry and a lot of really great people who I became very close to and who helped build solutions who were in the forest industry, When I started working on fossil fuels and climate change, I approached oil and gas companies wanting to meet with them to understand the CEO's perspectives on climate change, to see if there was any common ground that we could find on climate policy. And I think in so doing, I wasted a lot of years. Maybe that's too harsh. I learned a lot of things. But in fact, what I realized is those companies are not set up to be energy companies. They're not set up to be part of the solution. They have a structural bias against being part of the solution. And there are a lot of people in the senior management of oil companies who have systematically been holding back climate progress and climate policy and weakening climate policy. And I now have evidence of that. And so I think perhaps in the early days of working on climate, I was actually too wedded to getting rid of the polarization. And I created a lot of space that actually gave the industry more power.
McDonald Stansby said that your philosophy is about accepting power and attempting to persuade it rather than confronting power and dismantling it. Have you changed your mind?
Well, first of all, I've never really had a robust conversation with him. So he has a lot to say about my work, but he's never actually talked to me about it, just so you're clear. Second of all, I wouldn't say I'm about one thing. I've been doing this work for 30 years. And so sometimes, sometimes I feel like it is really important to, put a finger in the dam and get a policy passed right away that is going to stop some destruction that's happening, to get a new policy in place. And that is not a systemic change. But with my work now, and for the past 4 years, for example, with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, that's about building power. That's about building power and fundamentally changing the structures and international agreements and global governance, as well as the social norm around fossil fuels. So I don't think my work has been one size fits all.
So one of my research questions about polarization asks if we're more polarized than we've ever been, or if we've always been polarized. I'm curious what your thoughts are.
I think we are seeing a continued increase in polarization that is fed by our use of social media and social media's use of algorithms that reinforce our existing beliefs and the beliefs of our tribes. I think there's lots of data to show that. I grew up, you read the newspaper. You read the newspaper in the morning, you got it, you opened it up, and you read everything that was in it because you read the newspaper. And then you sat down at 6 o'clock or 10 o'clock and you watched the news and you saw all the stories that were in them. I don't know anyone today who does that. That we go online to Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or TikTok and we see what we're fed. And what we're fed is what the system thinks we're going to like. So there's no question that polarization has increased. And we've all stepped more solidly into our ruts, into our tribes. And we're not just seeing other people's point of view. We're actually seeing an entirely different world than other people are seeing. We don't all read the same news or see the same newscasts anymore, because what we see is filtered through our biases and our tribes. And I work really hard to try and get out of that every day, because my job is to make social change. I can't understand how to make social change, how to mitigate global climate change or protect more forests or whatever I'm working on, if I don't understand what the world looks like right now, and not just what the world looks like to me, but what the world looks like.
Okay, so let's dig a little deeper in that. Stephen Sondheim was an American composer and lyricist. In an interview with D.T. Max in the New Yorker, he said, "My idea is that every moment of human intercourse, like right now between you and me, there are 64 of you in this room and 64 of me in this room that we bring into a conversation. So every sentence we say, any intercourse we have, is filled with layers." So I'm curious what those layers are to you. What do you think he's saying? How does it relate to the complexities of the conversations we have? And are there some moments that stand out for you?
I love that saying. Like it's, I think about it a lot. I think about it more through the work of, I mentioned tribes already, that there's a book that was written years ago by an author named Jonathan Haidt. It's called The Righteous Mind. It really changed my work. It really opened me up to a better understanding of how people understand the world, how we understand the world, and how we decide what to act on or what our opinions are based on. Because I think as an academic before, I really thought, well, my opinions are based on information. And it's such a simplistic view. So who are the 64 people? When I walk into this room, I'm a mother. I'm a Jewish mother. I'm a woman, a white woman who comes from a background of middle class privilege. I'm an environmentalist who spent 30 years trying to protect living systems from extractive industries. All of those different things that I've just mentioned. Sometimes I think of it as, those little glasses when you're getting your eyes tested and a lens drops down and the world looks different, then another lens drops down and the world looks different again. I think of it that way sometimes. I have a lens as a woman, I have a lens as a feminist. I have a lens as a mother. I have a lens as a Jew. I have a lens as an environmentalist. When you add all those up, those are the 64 people or 64 experiences that are walking into the room. Right now, connecting it to your previous question, I think about that a lot because I'm doing diplomacy on fossil fuels, working to try and convince governments that they should cooperate to slow down and manage a decline in fossil fuel production so that we can ensure that we have a safer climate and we mitigate global climate change. Because the Paris Agreement doesn't address the stockpiling of more and more fossil fuel production that locks in future emissions. It only addresses emissions reduction, not production decline. So I'm working on this fossil fuel treaty. When I go to meet a government representative from another country, I have to figure out how I can connect with that person to have the conversation. And so there are lenses, and I think that's true of any conversation we have on a hard topic, especially climate change. The lenses that someone else sees the world through is going to have a deep impact of whether they can hear you and whether you can have a really important conversation. If I'm talking to someone from a country in Africa, I probably will start the conversation around fairness, around equity, around energy access. But if I'm talking to someone from the South Pacific Islands, talk about extreme weather and vulnerability. And so that's just a very simple example of how you kind of have to look through and reach through people's experience in order to be able to speak to people in a way that they can hear you.
I want to dig a little deeper. How do you think that cultural, societal, or demographic factors such as age, gender, ethnicity, or political affiliation influence the dynamics of our conversations?
You know what we often forget? Whether you're in cabinet or you're a minister or you're a prime minister or no matter who you are, you're a person. And you're a person coming to that conversation with your lived experiences and your 64 people inside of you or your lenses in front of your eyes. And I've really learned that over the years. It has been sometimes really shocking to me how change is made and how decisions are made and how much that is a result of an individual's lived experience and their perspective. Why did British Columbia get the first carbon tax, economy-wide carbon tax in North America? Back in 2000 and what was it, 6? Before any other jurisdiction was even talking about carbon pricing. Why did that happen? Not because of the evidence that it's a good policy, not because of it happened because one guy read a book that changed his life. Gordon Campbell read Tim Flannery's book, The Weathermakers, on holiday in Hawaii, and he was the premier of British Columbia, and he got scared about climate change. And that impacted him. And there's lots of individual reasons that I could cite that good policies weren't put in place because those individuals had whatever their influence was, their cultural influence, their etc. So we like to think that we all sort information, according to facts and data, and that we make evidence-based decisions. And sometimes that's true. More often than not, there's a lot of layers of biases in an individual. Or they know that there is in the electorate or the people that matter to them, either their stockbrokers or their board of directors or their voters. And they pull their hearts out to try and understand how those influences and biases collect so that they can understand what their position should be on a particular issue. And that's what politics is. And it was the early feminists who coined the term politics, the personal is political. That's true in so many ways.
So I'm curious, how can individuals manage their emotions when the personal becomes political during challenging dialogues? We've had some really difficult conversations due to Trumpian politics, COVID, and many other issues. So I'm curious, in the context of family, friends, or workplace environments, how can someone approach a conversation about polarizing issues without jeopardizing relationships?
Yeah. I have a lot of family that work in the oil and gas industry in Alberta, and I worked for years on Canadian energy and fossil fuel issues. So, as you can imagine, those were some hard conversations, especially when it came to the pipeline campaigns, etc. But honestly, I think now, whether it's in my family or whether it's in a work environment, I do the same thing. I mean, first, I look for common ground or common lived experience that we can talk about that can create some form of connection. Being a parent, we're both parents, or I simply ask people about their lived experience. I'll tell you a quick story. When I was co-chairing the Oil Sands Advisory Working Group in Alberta, I was appointed by the Premier of Alberta to co-chair this Oil Sands Advisory Working Group table. It's industry, government, municipal level government, labor, scientists, Indigenous people, a lot of oil companies, trying to design climate policy in the oil sands. You can imagine that. It's an interesting 2 years, and I was co-chairing it with the former CEO of Shell and Melody Lepine from the Mikisew Cree. We decided that we should try and get the people who are in the committee to go to dinner together a couple times when we were doing meetings, get to know each other, and maybe the meetings wouldn't be so rough. So I went to dinner. I'm standing at dinner beside this woman who's a mayor of a town in Alberta. And she says to me, starts out the conversation by saying, look, I know you and I don't agree on a lot of things. We don't agree on climate change. I don't even really think it's happening. And we don't agree on pipelines. And so let's just not talk about that over dinner. I'm like, okay, sure. Okay. And then I said, so tell me, when you're not doing this and having to sit on this committee, what's it like where you live? What do you do? And she starts telling me about how she's a farmer and how her family's been in farming in Alberta for decades. And we start talking about farming and she starts telling me how the growing season has changed so much, and now there's droughts and there's all this, and it's been so hard as a farmer, and farms are going out of business. And I just kind of let her talk. Then halfway through dinner, she says, she saw a look on my face and she goes, are you telling me that this is all because of climate change? And I said, I actually haven't said a word. And she laughed and we laughed and we had a glass of wine and I changed the topic. The next meeting, a month later, she pulled me aside and said, do you have any reports that you could send me? And she's quietly, so no one else is hearing, that you could send me on the impacts of climate change on agriculture and what you're seeing around the world. So I sent her some FAO documents, and the next time we had a conversation about that. And that was how our relationship grew. It was her lived experience. She came to the conclusion, and it's, you can't yell at a plant to grow, you can plant a seed and then you need to water it and then it has to grow, and so that's And I mean, I think that is a perspective as a result of age a little bit. You have to find common ground. You have to try and find and have a conversation that helps people come to their own perspectives. You can share information. But I think the big mistake that the climate movement and the environmental movement made for years is just making people feel so guilty that they turned away from it. Instead of making people see that we all are part of developing a solution to this problem together and have to be. So instead of giving people agency, we made people feel guilty and made people overwhelmed. And so then they turn away.
This radio program and podcast is called The Conversation Lab. I'm Don Schaefer, and today we're speaking with Tzeporah Berman about Stand.earth, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and how we navigate difficult conversations with people who have differing opinions, values, and beliefs. I was struck by the story you told when you were on the Oil Sands Advisory Working Group and the discussion or the dinner conversation you had with the mayor from Alberta and your strategy of looking for common ground. It reminded me of a quote from Loretta Ross, who says, "You can't change people. You can't even change the person you're married to. You can help people. You can expose people to different information and help them learn." And she says, but you have to do it with love. In contrast, Alicia Garza, who was one of the founders for Black Lives Matter, said, "Social movements that need to grow to win often devote more energy to keeping people out than pulling people in," which maybe speaks to that call-in, call-out culture about how some social movements become too restrictive. And there isn't common ground.
Yeah, I mean, I'm struggling with the question a little bit because most of the organizations that I work with, their inability to widen the tent and open their arms to have significant engagement, especially from diverse walks of life, has a lot more to do with resources than it has to do with ideology or practice. Because the fact is that doing actual engagement where you give individuals something meaningful to do and a way to participate in the organization or campaign that you have created takes staff. It takes money, it takes capacity. And that's actually hard to fund. It's hard to fund in the climate movement. I know funders, so many funders that would love to fund a $100,000 report that'll make them look smarter than smart, or a new analysis by a consultant, but they're not going to fund an organization to actually have a staff person who is an organizer who's there to answer the questions and support volunteers or the public who want to engage in the issue. So I think engagement organizing is a dying art in some ways, and it's absolutely critical to be funded by progressive causes, and that will address it. And I think there is also an exclusivity in a lot of movements that is that turns people away. Sometimes inside the culture of some of the organizations I work with, we talk about how some people in organizations weaponize identity, whether it's indigeneity or it's BIPOC identity, etc., and use it, whether they mean to or not, as a way of kind of ring fencing who's allowed to play and who's allowed to participate, and not leading to a deeper conversation of decolonization or reconciliation or anti-racism, but instead often pushing people away so that they're afraid to have the courage to engage in diverse organizations or to speak out on the issues. And that's a travesty, because we need people to do the unlearning that's necessary, and we need people to be able to be willing to engage in the tough issues and not to be turned away from them. That said, we also need to make sure that folks inside of the environmental movement and the climate movement who are Indigenous, who are BIPOC, have safe spaces and are and have a culture that is supportive of them. So it works both ways.
Great answer. And it looks at the bigger issues. Is racism and prejudice innate, or is it learned through the discussions in everyday life, our families, media, books, and so on?
Oh, I think it's definitely learned. I think it is. It's bias that um, we live in a racist society. We live in a colonial society, an anti-Semitic society, and a patriarchal society, and that those where power has been held by a very few predominantly white men. And so that decades of history. And so that is, those biases are embedded. They're embedded in our education system, they're embedded in our political system, they're embedded in our families and in our culture. And I think in my lifetime, I've seen significant strides to address those biases and to work on them, to bring them to the forefront and to disrupt the status quo and power systems that hold them into place. But we've got a long way to go. But is it innate in people to be that way? I don't think so.
Okay, so if it's not innate and it's learned, how do we unlearn this stuff?
I mean, I guess it depends on which issue we're talking about. But I would say the first thing I would say is to do the work. Do the work. Read. White Fragility. Read books in Canada by Arthur Manuel and other Indigenous authors that are teaching us about reconciliation. Read the full report of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee and the recommendations. This is hard work and it's necessary. And I mean, right now, with the massacre by Hamas of Israeli citizens, and then Israel's retaliation, I feel like I've seen the worst of the progressive left, quite frankly. Um, it doesn't matter what has been done. War crimes are never okay. Terrorism and brutality, like we're seeing from Hamas, is never okay. And I mean, I'm saying that as a Jew who believes in Palestinian liberation. I'm not blind to the apartheid, and I'm no fan of Netanyahu's government. And I think there's lots that Israel has done wrong. But the fact that, minutes after there's already, memes on Facebook about, yay, Palestinian liberation. Hamas is not about Palestine. Hamas is about killing Jews. And that's exactly what they say, not just in Israel, but all over the world. And the progressive left's kind of knee-jerk reaction to support, to equate what Hamas is doing and what Israel's doing, and et cetera, and not do the work of really understanding what's going on in the region and the complexity of it. In my mind, that's lazy and dangerous, and it's anti-Semitic. And I think so. The answer is to do the work, take the time, and treat it like a job. I've had people say to me before, yeah, we did a diversity, equity, and inclusion workshop a couple of years ago. I'm good. This is lifelong work. When we have, when I look at what is on my book list, I make a commitment every year. Which new books am I going to read that are going to forward my thinking on equity and inclusion and reconciliation and decolonization? We have had a lifetime of bias, and it will take a lifetime of unlearning to create new patterns of thinking and activity in the world. So do the work. And don't think that it's less important than the issues that you work on. I think I did. When I first had my climate awakening, I remember thinking, we can't complicate these issues by talking about equity embedded in climate policy. We just have to stop carbon. This is a physical issue. And it's so simplistic because ultimately, why do we continue to have a climate crisis? It has a lot to do with power, how power is structured in our society, and what systems maintain that unequal power, and who's benefiting from the extractivist mentality that we have. Climate change is a result of colonialism and capitalism. So the idea that we can somehow solve climate change with some technocratic policies without actually addressing these larger issues of systemic racism and colonization and inequality is absurd.
Wow, that was perfect.
You're
Uh,
asking me some huge questions, so I'm
no,
sorry if
no,
I'm rambling on.
no.
They're not small questions. I don't know exactly where to take them, but you're just getting me unfiltered now.
No, it really is perfect, and it's so true. I was at the Rural Islands Economic Summit this year, and Ivy Piers, who is with the Namgis First Nations in Alert Bay, and she was talking about the same things that you're talking about. If you're going to come and visit us, do the work, and meaning understand the trauma and the experience of her people and what it means to live in Alert Bay and understand what they've gone through. And the point was not that we're going to get it all right, not that we're going to ask the right questions, but there will be some level of understanding in how we bring ourselves into these conversations, having done the work.
Yeah. I will never forget. I was at this retreat that I had actually organized, a strategy retreat on climate change, specifically around pipeline campaigns. And 3 days into the strategy retreat, we're all getting a little exhausted. There was about 80 of us or something, and we decided we did some skits in an evening to entertain each other. And some of the Indigenous caucus got together and did this skit. And I will never forget it because they played us. And so there's this row of Indigenous people, pretending to be, environmentalists. And there's an elder, and they come walking in and they're like, "Hi, it's so cool to meet you. We really appreciate you. And we know we haven't included you in any of the thinking or organizing for these events, but can you come and do the opening? And, no, you can't have more than 3 minutes on stage, but will you bless us?" And they, and they just did this like parody of what it's like to work with environmentalists from an Indigenous community's perspective. And I like was horrified right down to the core of my being, at the objectification, the romanticization, the simplistic way that we have in the past attempted as environmentalists to respect, traditional landowners and include indigenous rights in our agenda. And that was, that skit, honestly, was a turning point for me. That was like, I'll never forget it. I learned it in a different way. I saw it in a different way. And never again did I start organizing a campaign or a strategy meeting or a project where I didn't have partners from frontline and impacted communities and Indigenous nations right from the very beginning as partners, as leaders, listening to their ideas and not just asking them to perform.
David White always talks about asking beautiful questions, and the beautiful question is not the first question that comes to mind. The beautiful question is the one under the surface. It's the one you haven't asked yet. It means we have to be vulnerable, that we have to give as much as we ask for in the question. And it's often difficult for us to get out of our routine to ask the beautiful question. So moments like that put us in that space. I'm curious, what are your toughest conversations today?
I honestly think some of the toughest conversations are with people who um, understand the climate problem and they know that we need to change, but they just believe that somebody else should do it. You know, Canada especially. A lot of my friends are now in the Prime Minister's office or in the Ministry of Environment. These are a lot of climate experts who they've hired and are in government. And I think one of the big problems we're having now is that every country thinks they have a right to try and be the last barrel sold. I hear it a lot. "Oh, Tzeporah, we know the world will use less oil, but might as well be ours." Everybody's saying that. Every country I go to, every prime minister I meet with in a producing jurisdiction says that. And it's the ultimate tragedy of the commons. So everybody's rushing to produce more, to get more infrastructure in, to say that they're going to be the last barrel sold. And the result is we're on track to produce more than double the amount that the world can ever use. And so it's, leadership matters in the climate era. And those conversations are really hard. It's really hard to convince people that they don't have a right to compete in the free market because that's what they've grown up with thinking. And it's not that you don't have a right, it's that you have a responsibility to act in the public good. And the public good right now is not met by trying to just blindly increase profits and economic revenue at a moment when the planet is literally on fire. And so those are hard conversations. And then the harder conversations I'm having with countries in the global south is about energy access. Well, and about fairness. Like a lot of them are saying, look, it's our turn. You guys got to produce fossil fuels for the last 50 years, and that helped create your economies and the strength of your economies. So we should get to produce fossil fuels now. They're not necessarily wrong. The problem is we've blown the world's global carbon budget. There isn't more space in the global carbon budget for them to produce fossil fuels. So now we need to support those countries in leaping over the fossil fuel era and moving directly towards electrification of transport and heating, and at the same time address energy access. And that's difficult, especially when the wealthiest and most profitable companies on the planet are the oil and gas companies. So there's not a lot of capital out there flowing into countries in the global south to produce renewable energy. But it's not because renewable energy is not cheaper. It is cheaper. And it's not because renewable energy and electrification isn't available at scale. It is, and can replace almost all uses of fossil fuels. Not aviation, but aviation is 2% of global emissions. So, these are hard conversations. And, because ultimately what you're asking everyone is to go out on a limb, is to lead, because we have to at this moment in history. And that's hard.
But first and foremost, for me, is thinking that we need to change our conversations with each other one conversation at a time. To your point, you can't make a plant grow. So if we can learn how to have difficult conversations with each other, maybe we can get closer to the societal changes that we hope to see.
I used to have this sign up above my desk that said the 3 C's. And it was a reminder to myself for the difficult conversations. And my 3 C's in my little lexicon were common ground. Do whatever you can to find some common ground to connect with this person. Compassion. Have compassion, authentic compassion for what that person is going through in their life. And courage. Have the courage to face the hard stuff, to say the hard stuff, to not avoid the conversations because they're hard, because social change is hard. Common ground, compassion, and courage. For me, at least, for a good 20, 30 years, that's been the ingredients, the recipe for having the hard conversations. Authentically being compassionate for people and where they're coming from and why they have the positions they have. Trying to really listen and try and understand where they're coming from. You can't have compassion unless you try and understand and you ask them questions and you listen. Also finding common ground. There's going to be something that can connect you. But ultimately, you then have to have the courage to say, I respect you. I hear what you're saying, and I disagree. And here's why. And if you've made a connection, if you've authentically made a connection with someone, they'll be able to hear you more.
Good advice. Thanks for sharing. So what haven't we talked about that we should?
I don't know. We talked about a lot of things.
All right, so let's go back a little bit. When we first met, you had just written This Crazy Time, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that. What were you doing? What was going on?
Well, when I went to the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen, and as if anyone remembers that, it was a disaster, right? We couldn't reach a global deal. It was one of the most depressing things I've ever experienced in my life, because the contrast of sitting there in front of the world's leading scientists who were literally crying as they were presenting their reports because the science that had come out that year was so devastating. The head of the Secretary General of the United Nations opens the conference by saying, we either reach a deal here to address climate change or we are dooming humanity to oblivion. The UN Secretary General, right? Like that's the contrast. And then we did nothing, right? Yep. So I got really depressed. And I came home and I thought, it's too big. We're all doomed. I don't know what to do. And I ended up spending some time with my grandmother, who was in her 90s. And I was telling her about this. And she said to me, are you kidding me? Like, do you understand how much the world has changed in my lifetime? She said, when I was having your mom and her 7 children, she had 7 children. She said, we didn't have a car. I didn't know anyone who'd ever lived on a plane. We didn't have a television. We had a radio. We had a phone, but it was a party line. When it rang twice, it was for us. And so she said, no one had ever even thought of computers or cell phones or that Raspberry you're always holding. She said to me, talking about my BlackBerry. And she said, so the world will entirely change in your lifetime. There's no question that it's possible for the world to change in your lifetime to such an extent that these issues can be addressed. And so when I get overwhelmed, I think about that moment. And I think about this I imagine telling my grandchildren years from now about this crazy time in our history, when we dug at the earth to get at the last of the oil, this crazy time in our history when we chopped down the last old growth to make catalogs, or even this crazy time in our history when we used to fill our cars with gas. And they'll barely believe me because the world will be such a different place.
That's a great story. Love your grandma.
Yeah. Yeah, it was actually one of the last conversations I ever had with her. And it was so important to me. And that's why I shared it in the book, because, we can get overwhelmed. These are really big issues, but the trends are incredible. Globally, look at China. The increase in consumption of electric cars went up 400%. Globally, it's up 60%. The world is changing so quickly. And people get depressed. It's not an easy time on climate change, but I just keep thinking, no single politician or president could have stopped the move from horse and buggy to car or landline to cell phone, And so that the changes that we're seeing in technology and in finance, they trump any other single event. Is it too early for puns?
No, it's always a good time in this particular case. But your comment and the discussion with your grandmother, provides hope, which takes us to an issue that I wrestle with, which is how do we get more people engaged? How do we make it a simple conversation as opposed to such an overwhelming conversation?
Well, first of all, I think we have to talk about it as not about our lifestyle. It's not about whether you drove here to this interview. It's not about whether you're eating meat. I mean, it's true that lifestyle changes are important, but it's not about better light bulbs. It's about better laws. And we have to stop making people feel guilty. We live in a system that supports and is supported by a lot of fossil fuels right now. We do. And we all contribute to it. The most important thing we can do is make sure our elected officials and those corporations know that we're advocating for change. They need to hear from us. We need to vote according to our values, because that's the scale of change that's going to be required. It's about new laws to phase out the use and production of fossil fuels. It's about no new LNG plants in British Columbia. That's not the way to build our economy. We need to build it with high tech, with clean tech, with tourism, with supporting businesses like the film industry that we already have right now. And so, I think the way to get people engaged is to stop making them feel guilty and start making them feel like there's hope. And if we all engage, there's hope. And I honestly find that the engaging in these issues is the antidote to despair, because we do make change. When you connect with 1,000 people through a Lead Now petition or a Stand.earth petition or a David Suzuki Foundation event, then they can aggregate those numbers and go and meet with politicians. That's how we got a national climate plan. We also got a national climate plan because hundreds of people rallied in the streets against those pipelines. I mean, it's true, the government has approved the pipelines, but there was never more an important moment in our history than right now to be dusting off those placards and hitting the streets.
So before we hit the streets and wrap it up, any chance there's another book coming?
I have so many started books. I can't tell you. My problem is I don't slow down long enough to finish writing a book. I started a book that I was going to call Dinner with the Enemy, based on my 4 years of experience of working in Alberta and the dinners I hosted with oil CEOs, between oil CEOs and environmentalists, because it would be a fascinating book. And I learned a lot during those 4 years. But then I won the Climate Breakthrough Award, and I had the money and support to start the Fossil Fuel Treaty, which is what I wanted to do after the Alberta experience. So then I launched this idea for a fossil fuel treaty, and that's been like being shot out of a rocket. I'm, in discussions now with 20, 30 countries. I don't stop long enough to write, so maybe someday.
Well, I look forward to that day. In the meantime, I really want to thank you for taking time to join us. I really appreciate your help with my dissertation project and helping in this research. I hope the questions weren't too extreme. And most importantly, a heartfelt thanks for all the work you do on our behalf.
Nice to see you.
We've been talking with Tzeporah Berman, International Program Director at Stand.earth and the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. We've been talking about her work as a Canadian environmental activist and the cause and effect of polarization on the words we use in the conversations we have and how they impact how we talk about climate change and other difficult subjects. You can learn more about Tzeporah's work at Stand.earth and at fossilfuel.org. And if you want a good book recommendation, check out This Crazy Time, Living Our Environmental Challenge. Sticks and Stones, Roots and Bones is part of my dissertation project with the University of British Columbia. It's also a radio program and podcast produced in Vancouver's downtown east side at the Conversation Lab on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. It's available on community and campus radio stations across Canada and, of course, on your favorite podcasting platform. Thanks to my supervisory committee, Drs. Manel Matani, Janice Stewart, Denise Ferrara da Silva, Jan Fook, and Andy Hoffman, my cohort at UBC Social Justice Institute, friends and family who support this passion project, and of course Jason Shaw, who composed the music for us. Thanks for listening. I'm Don Schaefer.